And Ciara Bourne.
Hello, everybody. So you're very welcome to tonight's presentation from Paul O'Brien. So I'll just give you a very brief introduction into what that is about and what you can expect to hear here. 1 second now, I'm just getting my view up. Okay, so Liam O'Flaherty's novel Share with Seán O'Casey and his plays a particular critique of the way the 1916 Rising and the War of Independence was mythologized in Irish history. In both of their works, they constructed a radically different interpretation of the traditional narrative that underpins the ideology and the legitimacy of the Irish Free State. So O'Flaherty shared O'Casey's argument and his view, a lot of his views on how these events unfolded. Their books were banned because of their criticism of the moral, social, and economic backwardness of the Irish Free State. The Free State government used the idealism of 1916 and the War of Independence as a cover for their conservatism. I can't pronounce that word, so I'll work on it, in economic and social issues in the new state. O'Casey and O'Flaherty were just some of those who were publicly questioning this orthodoxy. They came closest to putting forward a socialist critique of post-revolutionary Irish society. They set out to get rid of Ireland of this dead weight of heroes, which they maintained had paralysed the people from taking any action that might transform their lives. So in this talk, Paul O'Brien explores both the political and literary response to O'Casey's Dublin trilogy from 1923 to 26, and O'Flaherty's novels The Informer in 1925, The Assassin in 1928, and Insurrection in 1950. And even though their friendship, political and personal, fractured as a result of O'Flaherty's criticism of O'Casey's The Plough and the Stars in 1926, these whole issues will be explored in Paul's talk. So Paul O'Brien himself, he's a writer and activist. His book, Seán O'Casey, Political Writer and Activist, will be published in spring 2023. So now I'll hand you over to Paul O'Brien now.
Okay, thank you, Katrina. I think the first job of any talk like this is to get your subjects born. And O'Casey and O'Flaherty came from very different backgrounds. O'Casey was born in 1880 in 85 Dorset Street. He was born into a lower middle class Protestant family, and that made him quite different from the background that O'Flaherty came from. But his father's death in 1886 was the beginning of a gradual slide into poverty. And when he was 9 years old, they left the Dorset Street area and moved to the East Wall, first in Hawthorne Terrace and then in Abercorn Road, where he lived for the next 30 years of his life. And these were really the formative years in O'Casey's life. He worked as a labourer out of Amiens Street for the Great Northern Railway. He joined the Gaelic League in 1903, the Irish Republican Brotherhood in 1905. And but the really transformative moment in his life was his participation in the 1913 lockout. And as he himself put it, he stepped out from under the green banner and embraced the red banner of socialism and remained faithful to that banner for the rest of his life. And by the time his first play, Shadow of a Gunman, was published, he was actually a very experienced writer. He wrote sketches and for the magazines of the Gaelic League. He wrote for Slot, that's the St. Lawrence O'Toole Club. He wrote for the IRB paper, Irish Freedom, and the Irish transport paper, Irish Worker. And even by the time his first play was accepted by the Abbey, he'd already written 4 plays, which they had rejected. O'Flaherty, by contrast, came from the west of Ireland. He was born on Inishmore, the largest of the Aran Islands in 1896. And he was a clever young lad, and the local priest decided that he was ideal material for the priesthood. So he was sent off on a scholarship, first to Rockwell College, and then to Blackrock College in Dublin, and then on to UCD to train as a priest. But he left in 1915, joined the British Army and served on the Western Front, and was invalided out, suffering from shell shock in September 1917. And he spent a number of years after that traveling around the world, working as a laborer, a deckhand, a lumberjack, and all these experiences actually come out in the novels and short stories that he subsequently wrote. O'Flaherty returned to Ireland and a few years later, and was a founder member of the Irish Communist Party in 1921. And he led the ill-fated socialist occupation of the Rotunda in January 1922. This was just after the acceptance of the treaty by the Dáil and the formation of the Free State, the partitioned Free State. 200 workers, led by O'Flaherty, ran up the red flag over the Rotunda, which is, the Gate Theatre in Dublin, and declared that it was under the control of the Council of the Unemployed. The occupation, or Soviet as some people called it, lasted 4 days before it was attacked by the police and a right-wing mob. And O'Flaherty decided to end the occupation before people got seriously hurt. And soon after that event, he began to write. And his first story, which was The Sniper, which was published. These are various photographs of O'Casey as a young man. And also, this is the first known photograph, or at least the first photograph I know of O'Flaherty as a young man. And this is the age he would have been when he wrote his first story, The Sniper, 1923. And he was a very prolific writer in this particular period. And his first novel, The Neighbour's Wife, also appeared in the same year. And that was followed up by a short story in 1925, The Discarded Soldier, and his breakthrough novel, The Informer, in 1925. And it's at this point is where the paths of O'Casey and O'Flaherty cross, both politically and as writers. Now, in this talk, I'm going to concentrate on their output in the 1920s, because that's the most politically active period for both of them. It's also when they were at the peak of their output in terms of their literary output. I mean, in this short period, O'Flaherty wrote a number of short stories. As I said, The Sniper, 1923, The Disabled Soldier, 1925, The Terrorist, 26, The Civil War, 1925. And these were all deeply political short stories commenting on the outcome of the War of Independence and the Civil War, his disillusionment with the Free State that had emerged from the War of Independence. And of course, it was also his classic novel, and which he's best known for today, The Informer, which came out in 1925. Both of their work from this period, that's say between 23 and 1930, were written by committed socialists, but they were mavericks. Neither of them could really cope with the structures or commitment or discipline of revolutionary organizations. And neither O'Casey nor O'Flaherty lasted very long in their organizations. O'Casey had joined the Socialist Party of Ireland, inspired by the Russian Revolution in 1917, but he drifted away in early 1919. Similarly, within a year or two, Flaherty had drifted away from the Irish Communist Party. And in many ways, even though it's a dirty word today politically, they were the first revisionists. Dermot Ferreter in The Plough and the Stars wrote this. He had to say about it, about a production there a number of years ago. Dermot Ferreter, the modern historian. He said that O'Casey refused to simplify or romanticize what is a painful and challenging time, and that he refused to be pious or reverential or indulge those craving glory and gratitude. And in doing so, he had the clarity of the historian 50 years before professional historians managed it. And that could equally apply to Liam O'Flaherty in his work from that particular period. Both of them set out to subvert the myths that had transformed the radical content of the revolutionary period into an inward-looking, church-dominated, backward free state, conservative society, which emerged from the establishment of the Free State in 1922. I mean, both O'Casey and O'Flaherty commented on how they painted the buses and the mailboxes green, but had left the mass of people in poverty and exclusion. And if you look at the writings from this period and in their personal lives, they stood out against the sanctifying of the 1916 rebels and those who fought in the War of Independence. Their work from this period comes the closest to putting forward a socialist critique of post-revolutionary Irish society, while at the same time, and this is important, criticizing the failure of the left to make an effective intervention in what the new state might actually look like. If we take The Sniper, that's his first story, 1923, and Shadow of a Gunman, which is also 1923. The Sniper is the story of a free state and a Republican sniper who are on roofs on opposite sides of the street, each trying to lure the other into the open to get a shot off. And the Free Stater is killed. And as was quite common in that day, because these were friends, family, relatives who fought against one another, the Republican sniper wonders if it is a former comrade or friend that he had killed. And he goes over to the other side of the road and climbs up on the roof. And what's interesting about the story, while we observe the action through the eyes of the Republican soldier, there's nothing heroic or there's no reasons why they are fighting, explained in the story as to why they are fighting each other. It's a sort of an abstracted story that he actually presents. The politics in 1923 would have been understood by almost everyone who read that story. And so it's more of a psychological story that he is actually presenting. And it has a very dramatic ending. As I said, he goes over wondering who is the person. He can't help himself, but go over and wonder who is the person that he shot. And it finishes very dramatically. The sniper turned over the dead body and looked into his brother's face. And that's the closing line of the story. And I think in that, he absolutely gives, would have nailed home to the audience just the hopelessness of the Civil War, given the outcome that actually happened as a result of it. It was published, that's there, the cover of The Informer, and it was published in this magazine, The New Leader. Now it's interesting that The New Leader was a London socialist newspaper. Given the time, 1923, it is highly unlikely that any Irish paper, magazine, or political paper would have actually published a story like that. It was just too dramatic. And O'Casey takes up a similar theme in Shadow of a Gunman. And this is where there are lots of parallels between the career of O'Flaherty and O'Casey, because what comes true in Shadow of a Gunman is how the rhetoric of romantic nationalism had consequences for the inhabitants of the tenements, regardless of whether they embrace those ideals. The outside world intrudes into their lives with little regard for their safety or aspirations. If you remember at the end of that, of The Shadow of a Gunman, it's not the shadow of a gunman, Donald Daverin, that is killed, but Minnie Caldwell, who actually saves his life, and she's killed as a result of that. And The Shadow of a Gunman is perhaps O'Casey's most pessimistic play, with few signs of hope that either they or external political forces can change their circumstances. And what's interesting, like O'Flaherty's story, The Shadow of a Gunman does not have a conventional ending that can provide closure for the audience. They were left to reflect on the outcome of a decade of revolution that was drawing to a close. However, as in all his work, the social significance of the play is just as important as the historical aspect, and the location, in other words, the East Wall location, is chosen with as much care as to the date of the action. Now, O'Casey and O'Flaherty met up for the first time, at least as far as we know, this was the first time they met up in 1925. In that year, O'Flaherty, with a number of his literary and artistic friends, had set up the Radical Club. And it's fascinating, if you go back and try and research the Radical Club, there's almost nothing about it in the history books, but it was an important club at the time. It had poets like F.R. Higgins, artists like Patrick Toohey, and it pulled in a wide circle of artists, writers, poets into the club. And O'Flaherty invited O'Casey, whom he admired as a writer, to actually join the club. It was a forum for intellectual workers that was interested in freedom of cultural expression in Ireland, against censorship. It was a reaction against the staleness of the Gaelic revival, and one of its objects was to prepare Ireland for the arrival of modernism and the avant-garde in literature and art. And at that time, O'Casey, O'Casey had completed Juno on the Paycock. That's a picture there on the right, very famous, Sarah Allgood, and I'm not sure who's playing Johnny Boyle in it. And this is the first edition cover of The Informer from 1925. And O'Casey had completed, and it had been presented on the Abbey stage. And O'Flaherty was producing the Informer. And both works are a reaction to the heroic image of the revolutionary period, where in particular, Connolly and Pearse are elevated into sainthood, devoid of any political content. Both works are about betrayal, the irrelevancy of the politics of the community in which, of politics to the community in which they are set. Juno is set just in the closing days or closing months of the Civil War. It was produced in 1924, and Johnny Boyle, who fought in the War of Independence and the Civil War, was maimed as a result of an explosion during the Civil War. And for whatever reason, which we never really know, Johnny betrays his former comrade and neighbor, Tancred, to the Free Staters. And for this, Boyle is captured and executed by Republican forces for his betrayal. And it's the same story that actually runs through The Informer. And if you look at the critique of Juno and the Paycock today, critics always emphasize Juno as the important character, the central character of that play. She is normally presented as a sort of a modern Mother Courage, a paragon of womanhood, of motherhood, holding the family together in times of crisis. And it's usually contrasted to the violence of men in these modern critiques of the play. But O'Casey always identified the play with Johnny Boyle. It was his intention that Johnny Boyle, should be the central character. And that's really the problem with the play, because we don't know why Johnny Boyle betrayed his comrade. O'Flaherty, who saw the play and admired it immensely, and you can see, if you read The Informer, how much of Juno and the Paycock, and particularly the betrayal of Boyle of his comrades, is sort of finds its way into the Informer. But he wrote to his editor in London saying in 1925, "The play is a fine thing. It is called Juno and the Paycock, a fine piece of realistic work, but in my opinion, he spoils it with tragedy." And I think in this, O'Flaherty puts his finger on the problem, because the explanation for Johnny's betrayal is overwhelmed by the comedy and the tragedy within the play. And years later, O'Casey expressed his dissatisfaction with Juno and the Paycock, and we can see why. Johnny's character, despite his intention that the play should focus, that he should be the central character which the play revolves around, his character lacks depth or complexity that might provide the political or psychological background for his betrayal of his friend and comrade. And this weakness in characterization and political context of O'Casey's actions left O'Casey open to the accusation, and it was made then and since then, that Juno and the Paycock was just an attack on the Republican movement that offered no alternative except to condemn violence for political ends. And the play, as I said, had a major impact on the Informer, which was written shortly after the production of Juno. It was a psychological thriller, unspoiled by comic relief, and just as in Juno, Gippo Nolan, the central character in it, betrays his comrade McPhillips to the police, who kill him in an attempt to capture him. And both Nolan and McPhillips were members of the revolutionary organization. And what's interesting is that O'Flaherty mentions no specific organization. Throughout the book, they are just referred to as the revolutionary organization. But it's significant that the book has a socialist background rather than that of a nationalist. Nolan and McPhillips were sent to scare the secretary of the Farmers Union, but they shoot him instead of scaring him. And for that, they are expelled from the organization. And the action of the novel, and again, this is where you can see why O'Flaherty said, I was trying to create a psychological thriller. So it's compacted into just 8 hours as Nolan is hunted down by his former comrades for his betrayal and put on trial by the organization and its leader, Dan Gallagher, who executes him. Now, there are problems with this novel as well. O'Casey intended Gippo, this in many ways brute of a man, a soul in torment. But I think O'Flaherty hoped that by the end of the novel, at least in readers' minds, Gippo Nolan would be transformed from harshness into sympathy. Into sympathy. Sorry, there, just. The book ends, the closing couple of pages ends. Gippo is captured. He escapes from his captures in the revolutionary organization. He's shot and wounded in the process, and he drags himself into the local church where the mother of McPhillips is saying her prayers, and he sort of crawls up to her. And again, this is, I think in many ways, the ending is far too soft in it. It's almost got a religious fervor and flavor in the way that he presents the closure of the novel. He says, Mrs. McPhillips, 'twas I informed on your son Frankie. Forgive me, I'm dying. I forgive you, she sighed in a sad, soft whisper. You don't know what you are doing. And with that, Johnny expires on the spot. So, you know, despite the fact that this is a very tight psychological thriller, I think the ending really doesn't fit what he was actually trying to achieve. But it does share with Juno a sense of hopelessness about the situation in Ireland in 1925. Dan Gallagher, who is the head of the revolutionary organization, is asked, Tell me, Dan, she whispers, do you believe in anything? Do you even believe in communism? Do you feel pity for the working class? No, he said, I believe in nothing fundamentally, and I don't feel pity. And that left, like O'Casey, it left O'Flaherty open to the accusation that the informer, in fact, is a reactionary interpretation of the events of the last 10 years, a condemnation of violence. But if you read both Juno and the informer in the context of the time in the 1920s, when people were reading it or experiencing it on stage, it's quite clearly to that audience, and we know this, that they saw it as a critique of the failure of the Free State and the left to do anything about the people who lived in poverty and exploitation. Now, both O'Casey and O'Flaherty were politically committed writers in whose work aspirations for peace, brotherhood, and happiness are subverted by war, class differences, and sectarianism. And O'Casey in particular portrays the tension between the desires of ordinary people to live their lives in peace and the real war which intrudes into their lives. And the play states quite clearly, and it's a very clear reading of it, that the Boyles, he's saying, the Boyles can't hide from the chaos enveloping them. And by the end of the play, O'Casey is suggesting that the audience can't either, that we really need to look for an alternative to what has been put forward by the Free State. In 1925, after the publication of The Informer, O'Casey, with his London publisher, called on O'Casey. At this stage, O'Casey had moved over to rooms on the North Circular Road and expressed support and encouragement for O'Casey's news play, The Plough and the Stars. And they read the first draft. And as I said, both of them expressed full support, thought this was one of the best things that O'Casey had written up to then. But relations between them soured. One of the reasons was what was going on in the Radical Club. He withdrew because he felt that O'Phelan was using him and the Radical Club as a vehicle just to attack W.B. Yeats and the Old Guard, and also that O'Flaherty was using the Radical Club just as for personal aggrandizement. And letters that he sent to his publisher actually backs up this. And following the riots following the production of The Plough and the Stars, O'Casey was very hurt by the attack on the play by educated Republicans, intellectuals, and academics, and in particular Liam O'Flaherty, who attacked the play in a long letter in the Irish Statesman. This is, where am I here? In the Irish Statesman, yeah, okay. It was a long, rambling, and largely incoherent attack on The Plough and the Stars, and also W.B. Yeats' attempt to stifle the protests. He declared that he was not a nationalist, that he was an admirer of any man who had the courage to die for an ideal. And he went on to say that the most glorious gesture in the history of our country was the gesture of those who died in 1916. Now, this was a total odds with the critical and anti-heroic portrayal of his short stories and novels of the preceding period. And he was also hurt by the debate in the Radical Club, where O'Flaherty led the charge while against his friend, while Patrick Toohey, the artist, defended O'Casey's work. Toohey was out in 1916 and was a member of the Irish Citizens' Army. And while their friendship never recovered from O'Phelan's attack on The Plough and the Stars, their work evolved from the 1926, 1927 in parallel but separate. And I think this was the real tragedy of the row over The Plough and the Stars and in the Radical Club. O'Casey left Ireland in 1926 and broke with the Abbey over their rejection of the silver tassie. And that was in 1928. And he never wrote again. He never wrote a play for the Abbey again. And that was a tragedy for both of them. Ireland lost its best playwright, and the Abbey also never really recovered from the loss of O'Casey as a leading playwright on their stage. And after his move to England, O'Casey became a committed supporter of the Communist Party and the Soviet Union. He was never a member, but supported it through the good days and the bad. And this was represented by his play, The Star Turns Red, very rarely produced, hasn't been produced, I think, since 1976 in this country or anywhere else indeed. But this was his contribution to the fight against fascism and the defense of the Soviet Union. It was written in 1939, the attack on Spain by the fascists and the rise of Nazism in Germany and the blue shirts in Ireland. While he remained a committed socialist, all for the rest of his life, O'Flaherty had a very different relationship with the socialist movement. And despite writing this book, I Went to Russia, he went there in 1930 and wrote this book about his experience of wandering around the Soviet Union. He never really engaged with either the Communist Party or any other revolutionary or socialist movement from the 1930s onwards. And both of them, I suspect, were very individualists, were very, had their own view of things, held their views very strongly. And I don't think, I think it would have been very difficult for them to accept the discipline of party structures, particularly the party structures that existed in the Communist Party in the 1930s. Now, that they should have been natural allies. There's no doubt about that. They're, both in terms of their writing and in terms of their beliefs, made them natural allies. And one novel, that's actually the French version, The Return of the Brute, and O'Casey's play, which the Return of the Brute was published in 1929. Sorry, it's such a poor representation. And the Silver Tassie, O'Casey's 1928 play, are very similar as well. They are anti-war. Both of them are written from the perspective of the ordinary working class soldier who is sent out to die or be maimed in a cause that has no meaning for them. And both of them wrote them to highlight the role of the ordinary soldier, the working class soldier, as opposed to the representation which had taken place since the end of the First World War, that somehow or other this was just a heroic event, the upper class soldiers, officers, etc. These are what were portrayed. And these were really the first to actually break from that convention and show what it was like for the ordinary soldier. And it's at this period that both of them fall foul of the censorship board. Again, it's interesting that, you see this parallel in their life. O'Casey produced this, O'Flaherty's book, The House of Gold, was the first novel to be banned in Ireland after the introduction of censorship in 1929. And it was the first of 5 of his novels that were actually banned. And this is a novel, The House of Gold, that is set in the post-Civil War period. It's set in the west of Ireland, where the old ascendancy class, the old estate owners, have been replaced by a combination of a corrupt native elite and the clergy. And O'Casey followed O'Flaherty into the banned list with his Windfalls in 1934, a book of short stories and articles, and also the first 2 volumes of his autobiography were banned in 1939. Right, I'll try and finish it up here. The rest of their writing career, both of them turned their attention towards what they perceived to be an oppressive Catholic theocracy that was stifling Irish society. O'Flaherty's book, The Puritan. The one on the left, the sort of fancy cover is the British edition, and the Puritan, the one on the right, is the American edition. It's interesting to see the contrast between the two of them. But this was, the Puritan, even by its very name, was a condemnation of the puritanical attitudes that had emerged in the Free State. You had contraception banned, divorce banned, censorship of books, church control of schools, of hospitals, etc. And this is what O'Flaherty in this novel focuses on. And the period, certainly for O'Flaherty, between 1923 and 1937 was the most productive in his career. 14 of his 19 novels, short stories, biography, journalism, were written in that period. And after the 1930s, with the exception of Insurrection, none of his later novels were met with critical success. And actually, he stopped writing novels shortly after that. And if you look, sorry for the bad photos there, but the reason I put both of those up, Insurrection, was that if you look at the two of them, the real contrast. This is a later edition. This is an earlier one. The one on the left is the earlier one. This is a representation of war. The burning buildings in the background. I think the soldier on the front is more likely to be from the Civil War period or the War of Independence than 1916. Whereas if you look at the one on the right, you can see here how the publishers have changed the whole tone of the book. Instead of being a heroic example of 1916, they sort of turn it into a religious focus. Many of you may have seen Michelangelo's The Pieta, which is in the Vatican in Rome, where Our Lady cradles the dying head of Christ in her arms. I mean, this is it's the religious symbolism right through the Middle Ages is represented, in that particular cover. After insurrection in 1950, O'Casey turned his attention to the short story. He published 3 volumes of short stories, and today he is mainly remembered and accepted in academic circles for his short stories. People have him up there with Frank O'Connor, Seán O'Whalan, as one of the great short story writers. And he, right through the 50s, the 40s and 50s, he mainly concentrated on short stories. And these stories were mainly about nature, set in the west of Ireland or elsewhere at sea. He has one about the butterfly who flies out to sea and gets tired and actually dives, is drowned by the waves. And sort of, they are beautifully written, and I think accepted today as some of the great short stories that came out of Ireland in the 20th century. O'Casey continued to write in perhaps more serious work. That's not to denigrate O'Flaherty's short stories. He wrote 4 volumes of biographies and plays exploring the reactionary role of the church in Ireland. The Bishop's Bonfire, 1955, Drums of Father Ned, 1958. And he died in 1964. After he died that in 1975, the first of 4 volumes of his letters were published. And these are really important, these letters, because they're a record of, the great events of the 20th century, both in terms of politics, history, and literature. And both writers, unfortunately, have suffered in the last 50 years or so. Most of O'Whalan's novels went out of print. Most of O'Casey's plays, with the exception of the Dublin trilogy, are rarely performed. Even today, they're rarely reformed. But the point is, I think, all writers have their seasons. And O'Casey and O'Whalan are too good to be left languishing in the second division for very long. And new editions of, particularly of O'Flaherty's books and academic interest in his work are bringing him back into view. And what's also interesting about O'Casey is that a new generation of directors, not wedded to the old classic productions, of the Abbey School productions, which always have emphasized the comic over the tragedy, are reinterpreting his plays for today. And more importantly, they are injecting the politics back into his work. I don't know if many of you in 2018, I think it was, the Anu production of O'Casey's last play, which is based on Nanny's Night Out. And it's a modern day reinterpretation of O'Casey's play, which talks about homelessness, poverty in modern day Ireland. It makes the link between what O'Casey was saying 40, 50, 60 years ago about poverty in Ireland and about poverty today. And the O'Casey in the Community, which was about a documentary, two-part documentary on RTE, was about a local production of The Plough and the Stars. And these productions and these ways of using O'Casey are bringing O'Casey home to the community that inspired his great works. So I leave it at that. And if there are any questions, be delighted to take them up.
Okay, thanks so much for that, Paul. That was, as usual, really fascinating and interesting. If anybody has any questions, you can number one, turn your video on. Paul, if you want to stop sharing now, then we can.
Yeah. So where hit my green.
I can try. I can do it for you if you want.
And yeah.
Let me see. Have to remember how to do it. This will stop other screen sharing. Do you want to continue? Yes. Oh, no, you have to do it yourself. Sorry. So if you go to your share screen button down at the bottom and click stop share.
Crikey. Share. I can't find
it should be a green button
down the bottom.
Let's say share screen. Yeah.
It's up the top of mine.
All right. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
I can't find any button that says stop share.
Oh, here, I can do it from here, actually. No, here we go.
Yeah. Okay.
So,
oh yeah, great.
So I'm going to put it into gallery. So people should be able to see themselves now. If you want to unmute or stop or play your video, that's okay. So if anybody has a question, if you want to raise your hand, you can do so. We have Kevin McHugh here with a question.
Oh,
yes.
Kevin McHugh, I'm broadcasting a couple of blocks away from John O'Casey's birthplace in Dorset Street.
Yeah.
What shocks me is the fact that Molly, the Museum of Literature in Ireland in Stephen's Green, has completely ignored one of our greatest writers. Have you any thoughts about that?
Do you want me to answer now, or do you want me to come back at the end? Okay, I'll come back on that. Yes, I have. Yeah. I went around there about, it must have been about 6 or 8 months ago, at the beginning of this year when it opened again to the public, and yeah, it did strike me very much so that, in other words, this is just my impression. It's too geared towards tourism. So you have the, Yeats and Joyce and all the names that people would know. I was very disappointed in the presentation, both in terms of the layout. Now, I know it was the 100th anniversary of Ulysses, and that's what the layout was for. So the emphasis was on it. But I certainly would hope that certainly in the future they'll have a broader view of how to present Irish writers, because, you know, I mean, it's O'Flaherty, O'Casey. I mean, there's a whole layer of people who are missing. For, you know, if you're not the Heeneys, the Yeats, the Joyce, the Becketts, and unfortunately, this government sees culture as something in order to sell tourism in the country with, rather than actually culture is something that can enhance the lives of people. And so, yeah, next time I'm there, I'm certainly going to raise that point with them. I think that's a very good point.
Nice.
Have we anyone else with a question there? Niall, is it, or Neil Martin? You have your hand up there if you want to unmute yourself. Yeah.
No.
Sorry, we can't hear you. Yeah, I can hear you now. Go ahead.
I can't hear him.
It's gone again. You need to.
If he turns off his video, the sound might be better.
If you just unmute yourself, there's a little button there.
No.
If he puts the question in chats,
He could do that.
you, you can find it then.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can't see him there now on the list. Oh, here we are. So I'm going to request that he. No, it's saying that he's not muted. You should be working there, Niall. No. Okay, so if you want to put that into the chat as a written question, we can come back to that. In the meantime, has anybody else got a question? You can raise your hand, or you could just unmute it. We have Mary Diskin.
No, no, we don't have. we don't actually have Mary Diskin. I'm using my wife's computer, but I can't. You should be able to change the name, but I'm not sure how to do it. So apologies for appearing under false pretenses. No, just on on two things. One is, you know, the fact that obviously O'Flaherty grew up as an Irish speaker, and O'Casey learned Irish and was in the Gaelic League, and I think did some earlier writing in Irish. Like you will see his stuff on the Citizen Army being signed as Seán O'Casey rather than Seán O'Casey. But really, apart from the short story collection Dul, O'Flaherty didn't write in Irish, and there is, I don't know whether it's I know O'Flaherty said it, but I don't know whether there's any independent record that himself and O'Connor wanted to sort of write and produce plays as part of the school curriculum, but were turned down both by Cunnan and Gaeilge and the department. So I just wonder if you have any thoughts about, you know, the two writers and the Irish language, and maybe their links, O'Flaherty's links with O'Connor. And then just the other thing is the short stories are about nature. But I read a lot of short stories in my time. I don't think I've ever read more bleak short stories about nature than O'Flaherty. Like, you know, it's not all little twittering, if you want to see like little twittering birds and happy nature. O'Flaherty's short stories aren't the ones to go to. Like it's something always gets killed, you know, at it, if you know, sort of at the beginning, the end, and sometimes at the beginning and the end. You know, so like it's nature as it is, but it's a fairly sort of bleak representation, like, you know, of nature. So I just wonder if there are any comments on either of those. I know they're more the nature of, you know, continent things than questions per se, Paul.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that it's very interesting about the Irish language. And look, this is just a thesis, right? Many speakers who came from Gaeltacht areas, who were raised in Irish-speaking areas, were, you know, mainly lived in poverty, small farmers or whatever, very impoverished areas of the country. And they recognized very quickly that if they wanted to get on in the world, then English is what they needed. And it's very telling that somewhere, I can't remember, I think it was in one of his letters, he talks about, you talked about O'Connor, and he mentions how when he was asked, why don't you write more in Irish? Because, you know, you're a native speaker. And he said, well, look at O'Connor, the man can't make a living. He recognized, you know, from writing in Irish, that writing in Irish really was, you couldn't live off it. You couldn't, an income just really wasn't possible. It was too small an audience in order to live as a professional writer. So I think that may be one aspect of it. And coming from the other side, if you like, O'Casey, coming from a Protestant, and his parents were, they weren't unionists as some people claim, but they were certainly, they weren't pro-ascendancy or anything like that. They were supporters of Parnell because they believed that Parnell was the only hope that Protestant people from their background might have a future in Ireland. But O'Casey then comes across the Irish language. He learns it. He becomes a very proficient speaker in Irish. And in time in the Gaelic League, he becomes a teacher, traveling down to Moycullen, Moy Valley, down in Meath, Finglas, Ballisk, sort of around the periphery of North County Dublin as a teacher. Now, he was never a paid teacher in the Gaelic League. And it's really in the Gaelic League is where he learns to be a writer. He used to write on Law of Darragh, the Red Hand, which was the little magazine. It was a handwritten magazine where the Drumcondra branch of the Gaelic League used to meet on a Sunday night, and people would read out their little stories in Irish. And O'Casey's was by far the most popular. People used to come from who weren't even members of the Gaelic League to hear the latest installment of the antics of the brother. Very similar to the sort of stories that Flann O'Brien would write 30 or 40 years later in the Cruiskeen Lawn column. And there is a theory, or not a theory, but a few people have put forward the idea that actually O'Casey began his career not writing in English, as people talk about, but actually writing in Irish. And also what was important was that his time in the Gaelic League gave him the sort of structure, the grammar, structure, syntax that the self-taught actually sometimes lack. And then it was later in the Irish transport with James Larkin who gave him this subject. And when you brought together his experience for writing for the Gaelic League and also the writing for the Labour movement, I think it was that fusion of those two experiences that really made him the great writer that he was. I agree with you about the short stories. When I say people, academics today, that really believe that that's where his strength lies, I think they're talking really about the structure, the language, the beauty of the, the construction of the sentences. But I think you're absolutely right. There's this almost running through the stories as a sort of a Darwinian, survival of the fittest that runs through the stories as well. Let's put it this: none of them end happily.
No. Was there a lack of Irish speaking? Sorry, was that a reaction as well to the sort of the very parochial attitude to Irish amongst the new Free State and the new Free State, that Irish was, there wasn't a love of Irish. It was just sort of, the whole sort of, you have to have Irish, but there was no positive attitude to Irish in the Free State.
You're absolutely right. I mean, what's interesting is after the 1920s, after the Free State was established, the Gaelic League, which when O'Casey joined it in 1903, it had 500 branches and 50,000 members. By the time, within a few years of the Free State being established, it had practically ceased to exist. It was only really the really dedicated who kept it going. And one of the reasons for that was there was a perception or an understanding among people that the state is now going to take on the job of reviving the language. But of course they didn't. They just paid lip service to the revival of the language. And one of the interesting things, one of the first articles in actually that O'Casey wrote, he wrote in the Irish Peasant, I think it was called, 1907, was about how to save the language. I mean, he was a very dedicated supporter of the Irish language. When he lived in Devon, he moved from London to Devon in 1938. He had a subscription to the Irish language paper in U and the Gaelic Book Club. And I think at least 4 of his plays were translated into Irish. Walter Macklin did the translation, I believe, and they were put on in the Taibhdeoch in Galway. So right through his life, he was O'Casey was a supporter, but of the Irish language, but that just doesn't seem to be the case with O'Flaherty. I always suspect O'Flaherty had moved more into the intelligentsia and left that part of his life behind him.
Okay, we have another question from Angus Laverty. What is Paul's view of the long-term consequence of the split between O'Casey and O'Flaherty? And then we'll try and bring you back in then, Niall, hopefully. Okay.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Very interesting question. I really think both of them lost out as a result of that split. I mean, both of them had very difficult personalities, and neither of them forgave easily. When a row happened with somebody, that tended to be it for either of them. I mean, you know, somebody wrote of O'Casey, you know, he never entered into an argument until he was sure it would be to his own detriment. And I think you can just say the same about O'Flaherty. And why I think it's important to highlight, or at least talk about, the split between them, the fallout between them after 1926, or beginning 25 and 26, is that they more or less were lone voices who were speaking out, who were publicly speaking out. Obviously, people were saying it privately as well. But in their writing, in their plays, in their books, in their public pronouncements, they weren't afraid to speak out about the encroaching nature of clerical domination in Irish society, about the fact that, you know, as I said, they painted the green, the buses green and the mailboxes green. But there had been no change in the social composition of Irish society. The Irish elite just stepped into the shoes of the departing British elite. And the fact that they fell out, I think actually weakened their voice. I think it is both of them commanded respect for their writing, for individually, for their politics in Ireland. And I think if they had managed a collaboration for another number of years, I think they could have been spokespersons for both in the literary sense and the political sense, for people who wanted to speak out or organize against the reactionary nature of the Free State. Because of that, both of them were lost really to Irish politics. O'Casey, as I said, departed in 1926, not because of the row over the Plough and the Stars, but shortly afterwards, he decided, when he went to London in 26, it was with the intention of returning to Ireland. But what it meant was that once more, some of our most important writers felt there was no place for them in Ireland. Similarly, after near the end of the 1920s, O'Flaherty had departed for London. Now, he did come back to Ireland after that, but he had really ceased to be a public voice. He wrote his short stories, he wrote a couple of novels, and then more, as I said, in the last 20 years of his life, he'd more or less retired from writing. So I do think if there could have been not a different outcome, but there certainly could have been more substantial voices raised if they had have remained political allies and literary allies.
Okay, we'll try and get Niall to come back in now.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Can you hear me now? Oh, good.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks very much, Paul, for your very enjoyable lecture and informative. One of the points that I thought about O'Flaherty's writing is this use of expressionism, which I thought was very effective in portraying the mindset of, as the characters were in The Informer, slum dwellers and their impressions of life and what the Civil War was doing to them. So I wondered what you thought about that.
I totally agree with you about that. And what's really interesting is that they were both influenced by German expressionism. The German playwright Ernest Toller, right, in O'Casey that first came across Toller in 1924, and there's no doubt Toller's expressionism. Toller was a socialist, a Marxist, and his expressionism, that method of writing, certainly comes through. Not so much in the very little in the Dublin plays, but you can see hints of it. His sort of tentative first steps towards expressionism, but it finds a fuller expression in the second act of the Silver Tassie. You know, that act that's set on the front in France, where the soldiers have no names. They're known as first soldier, second soldier, etc. And there's chants, rather than dialogue, backdrops. These are all straight out of German expressionism. And also O'Flaherty was influenced by Ernest Toller as well in his writings. That, as you said, that concentration on not on the great men and women of history, or even the lesser men and women of history, but the people who normally, what he did, he brought into the center of his novels and short stories people who normally just exist on the margins of literature or drama. And both O'Casey and O'Flaherty, I think, gave a voice to the marginalized. He allowed them, and this was the first time really in Irish literature, whether it was drama or novels, that working class or even the sub-working class were allowed to speak for themselves rather than have some academic or intellectual speak on their behalf. And so German expressionism, I think, was very important in their development as writers. Now, whether O'Flaherty had had experience of this before his engagement with Toller's work, which was, the early 20s. Now, as I said, he traveled. We don't know much about when he was after he was invalided out, and he traveled. He was, as I said, a deckhand, a stoker on a ship, a lumberjack. He worked in all sorts of jobs. And, whether he engaged with the emerging expressionist mode of writing in that period, I actually don't know. It'd be interesting to find out. But I think you're absolutely right to highlight that.
Thank you. Am I allowed a second question?
Yeah, go on.
Well, it's just about the previous question that you had about the Irish language. And I was at the Liam O'Flaherty Festival there on Arran. And one of the points that was made about the language, that around the turn of the 20th century, more often than not, certainly in the eastern part of Ireland, it was only the very elderly, the grannies, so to speak, in the household, that would be natural native speakers. The generation after that would know some Irish, but they wouldn't be speaking it in shall I say, just in a natural in a natural way, as something that they were brought up with. And you then, then a lot of, so when the new Free State government came in, there wasn't a lot of people who were, shall I say, the native Irish speaker. They had to, they had either picked it up from granny or they'd learned it deliberately themselves. So it was quite difficult to sort of, I'd imagine a lot in the government of the time, they weren't natural Irish speakers in themselves. And in fact, the fellows who were had all been shot in 1916. And I don't know whether I don't know what you'd think about that.
Yeah, I mean, there is, I mean, as I said, because I didn't want to spend too much time on it, I talked about how the decline of the Gaelic League, because people assumed the government would step in and take up the mantle in developing the Irish language. But there was also a feeling that the most dynamic members of the Gaelic League had been killed in 1916 and during the War of Independence, and therefore it sort of lost its dynamism when it lost these particular people like, you know, like Thomas Ashe and people like that. But I think it was more than that. It was the nature of the new state as well that really had no interest. I mean, this is a very long discussion about how could the language have been saved. I'll just do it, hopefully in one sentence. The language couldn't be saved on the basis of this is a good cultural artifact for us to have. It could have been saved as a living language only if the government was prepared to put the resources into the Irish-speaking areas to allow them develop on their own terms and in their own way and develop as a community that people would want to belong to. Because almost everybody in that particular period, you know, you'd be growing up in families 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Once you got past the first 1 or 2, the top 2 in the family, emigration was the only way economically for you to survive. Now, whether it was emigration up to Dublin or London or New York, if you were going to move out of your area, you needed English. And people recognized that and encouraged their children to learn English. So it's a very difficult argument. Should read you look them up, some of O'Casey's articles about the Irish language. I mean, one of the things he writes about the Irish language is, he says, I think it's a very famous, it's a very important phrase, and just simply analyzing the situation in the 1920s. You can't teach a starving child Irish. In other words, you've got to feed them, you've got to raise them up if they're going to then engage in culture, in Irish, in all the other things that, you know, are important in life. You know, if your next meal is the most important thing to you, well, Irish language goes very far down the list of your priorities.
Thank you.
Just in regard to the Irish language, there's also a huge difference between writing Irish and speaking Irish. You know, when I was like studying Irish, our lecturers used to say to us, you know, Aber cad boichlad ach scríb an focal ceart, you know, write what you like, but you must write, or say what you like, but you must write it correctly. And there's lots of, like, it takes a lot of its grammar structure and rules and regulations from Latin. And, you know, there might have been a case that a lot of native Irish speakers mightn't have had the proficiency in writing. I don't know, like, I'm not sure, but it might have played a factor in it.
Yeah, well, if you look at the structures of the Gaelic League, undoubtedly there were people in it who, you know, were native speakers, but in general they weren't. In general, they came from people who were learning the language because they thought it was important they understood it culturally. They understood, you know, that this was an important element of Irish society that needed preservation, that if we lose that, we lose our heritage. And but there during, and O'Casey was centrally involved in the arguments that were going on and around, 1910, 1915 and all that sort of period, over the nature of the Irish language, because there was an elitism in the Gaelic League as well that you put your finger on. I mean, one of the Father Morrissey, I think his name was, he condemned the idea that that Irish should be a compulsory subject for entry into the National University. In other words, what's UCD today, the Catholic University as he saw it, because he said there's a world of difference between the Irish of the university and the Irish and the common Irish that's spoken by the peasant. They, in other words, O'Casey always argued that the language had to be part of the social development of society. That's how we can revive Irish. These people just saw it abstracted from the social conditions that the native speakers were actually living in. And, there was, as O'Casey put it as well, there's a world of difference between the Irish spoken in the mud cabin and in the big ascendancy house. So, I mean, you're right. I still haven't got my head around the Mo Keneally, but there you go.
Well, let us know if you ever figure it out. You can make a bestseller there. Has anybody got any other questions they'd like to ask? I think we're okay here. I think Joe, oh yeah, that's a good idea from Ken McHugh, who says we should write to Molly to make sure that both these writers are installed there. We should do that.
Absolutely.
And the festival should do it as an organization as well.
I think that's a good idea. Yeah.
Okay, so I think Joe wanted to come back in to.
Yeah, just first of all, yeah, Ken, that was a great idea. And I think Katrina's right. I think the festival should draft up something to request that. That's a great idea. The discussion on the Irish language was really interesting. We've never had an Irish language event as part of the Seán O'Casey Festival. We were due to have one, and due to circumstances didn't, but we were told we will definitely have one next year. Having said that, anybody who's on here, if you have any ideas or any suggestions for next year's festival or subsequent festivals, please get in touch. We're going to start programming. COVID, like everybody, messed us up really bad. We are going to start programming next year's festival straight away when this one's out of the way. Katrina, you'll be glad to know. So if people want to be involved, they know any drama groups, anybody who wants to offer anything for next year's festival, we'd really love to hear that. What else was I going to say? I'm going to ask you a question, Paul, but just before that, just to come back to something you said earlier about the influence of O'Casey, and Ken again said about Joyce. Yeah, we have that all the time. Members of the history group liaise with tourist boards, tourist bodies, different groups in the area. We talk about the writers in the area, Liam O'Brien, and particularly, of course, Seán O'Casey.
Yeah.
But all they want to talk about was Joyce. They want to talk about pirates and James Joyce. Now, and the funny thing is, as Katrina knows, we know stuff about Joyce linked to the area that none of them know, but we never tell them, because all they want to do is talk about Joyce, not O'Casey. If they would take O'Casey on board and recognise importance, then we tell them the good stuff we know about Joyce that you don't know, but until then we won't. But the thing I was going to say then, Paul, is before I ask you a question, I mentioned this play, and you said about the influence of O'Casey and being reborn. And the local woman who wrote this was in her 20s. She was one of the cast members in O'Casey in the estate, and I think that was the first drama she ever done. And that's what brought her into it. She then went to the Lear and has now written her first play and is going to act in it next week. So that just shows you the influence of O'Casey. I mentioned this show on Saturday night, and these are not cheap plugs, by the way. And I said the all proceeds go to the sale project for women with addiction issues in the North Inner City. And I forgot to mention, on Saturday, the 1st of October, I think it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the finale of the festival is an afternoon presented by the Sale Project. It's going to be the women who are involved in the project doing their own stuff on stage. Some of them are doing O'Casey excerpts, some of them are doing songs, but most importantly, there's a book being launched that day, which is a book of the women's own poetry. So how more O'Casey can you get for our festival and to finish with these women from the area who have suffered because of deprivation, using art to help them come on in their life? So I'm sorry I forgot to mention that. It's probably the most important event we're doing in the festival, I would think, this year. Paul, question. This is a real me question, as Katrina will know. What do you think of the movies that were made of O'Casey's early works and O'Flaherty's, particularly The Informer, the two versions?
Yeah. Well, let's start off with O'Casey. Actually, with people, you know, if you look at the Hitchcock version, I mean, there were two films mainly made: the Juno and the Peacock and The Plough and the Stars. And you can see actually the influence of expressionism. They're quite actually dark films in both of those films. But unfortunately, particularly The Plough and the Stars was given the Hollywood treatment. If you remember, at the end of it, at the end of The Plough and the Stars, Jack Clitheroe is killed during the 1916 Rising, and his wife is really unhinged by the experience and loses her child, has a miscarriage. It has a very tragic ending in it, but I don't think that was acceptable to Hollywood, and they sort of they didn't quite walk off hand in hand into the sunset, but that dark side of the play was excised by that particular version. As far as I know, there have been, is it 3 versions? You'd know this far better than me. 3 versions of the Informer was made. The first one was made by his cousin, John Ford, the director. He's some, I don't know whether it's his first cousin or whatever, but he's a cousin of the O'Flahertys. And that was I thought that was a very interesting production. There was also a British production, which, you know, just to go back to the Hollywood production of it, Victor McLaglen played Jip O'Nolan. And I thought he really caught the essence of it. You know, this brute of a man who, for whatever failings, easy manipulated man, but that somehow or other, towards the end of it, they managed to show that there's actually some humanity behind the brutality of his character. So I thought McLaglen's portrayal of it was excellent. There was also the British production of it, which I've forgotten James Mason, I think, played Jip O'Nolan in it. And there was an intro. To be honest, I can't remember a great deal about it. But then there was another one sometime in the 60s, an American sort of TV film production, which sort of transported the story over to the era of Martin Luther King in America. I haven't actually seen it, but I've read about it. They certainly managed to transport the play, or the action of the play, into the situation of the civil rights movement in America in the 1960s. The other production, Young Cassidy, which was sort of based on the first volume of his autobiography, again, an American production, sorry, a British production that was. When I saw it back in the 1960s, I actually wasn't terribly impressed with it. I thought there was a bit of the stage Irish about it. But about 2 or 3 years ago, they showed it again. I think, Joe, you were at that viewing of it in the IFI. and it has actually come over far better than I originally remember it. I don't know if that's your feeling about the films.
Yeah, that showing of Young Cassidy was part of our festival that year. I think that was 2018.
That's right. That's right.
And it looked brilliant. I'd seen it on video and I'd seen it on TV, thought it was okay, but watching it on the big screen, I thought it was really good. I really liked it. There's a 1929, I think, or 27 version of The Informer, a British version as well.
Yeah.
Which has more politics in it, which is pretty good. And I like Juno and the Paycock, which is why we made a documentary about it. I do like it. It has its faults, but I do enjoy the movie. And you're right, the John Ford version of Plough the Stars is fairly poor.
Yeah.
Pretty much the same opinion. And I haven't seen that one, the Martin Luther King one either, but I will go and check it out now.
I think it's a sort of a TV film.
Okay. The James Mason one.
Now, I haven't seen it myself either, but I've read good reports that it does manage, as I said, you know, the way when a play is utilized as a basis for something else.
The James Mason one is Odd Man Out, isn't it? That you're talking about set in Belfast.
Oh, is that sorry. You're right. There you
go. That is an excellent movie as well.
The old memory is gone. Odd Man Out. You're right.
I can remember movies, nothing else. I'm going to confess, because there's somebody still on the chat that was on the walking tour on Sunday when we were talking about O'Casey and the Irish language. I said Cumann na Gael. Said he was a member of Cumann na Gael, and my brain just flipped, and I couldn't get it out of my head then. So the Irish language movement that O'Casey was part of was not Cumann na Gael. I just want to clear that up, Kate.
Yeah.
I did say to you at the time, my brain has flipped. But
that's the East Wall History Group rewriting history.
Rewriting. Yeah. Joe is the new revisionist.
But I got so embarrassed I couldn't clarify myself.
Look, you know, like it's like that, my confusion there on the Odd Man Out. I mean, you'd asked me about, I hadn't actually thought about the films for ages. And I remember James, I said the Mason character in the Odd Man was very similar to that Chip O'Nolan's character.
It's very dark as well. He's trying to escape through shadow streets.
It's all shadows and
And Paul, I'm not going to take up anyone else's time or too much more time, but I know we were talking about the other books. About 2 or 3 years ago, Hollywood Cemetery was republished. The O'Flaherty book. Have you read that?
No, I haven't. I've never seen a copy even of it.
Okay, it came out again a couple of years ago. I got it in Family Books, but it's excellent. It's it almost got the feel of a Marx Brothers or the kind of screwball comedy from the 40s. It's just about a guy trying to make it in Hollywood, but it's a really good read.
That was after he wrote that after he moved to America. He lived in America for a number of years. I mean, I have very interested, like his brother Tom O'Flaherty was a very interesting man. He was a member of the Communist Party in America. He wrote for the American Daily Worker.
A message from the gods.
You know, in many ways, Tom was quite a committed, organized, disciplined revolutionary. He was also a writer. He wrote some good stuff. I haven't got any of it to hand, but they were an interesting family.
Okay, thanks for that, Paul. And I'll stop talking now. Thanks, Katrina.
You're welcome. So if there's no more questions, we'll wrap up now. Thank you, everyone, for joining for what is always an interesting discussion from Paul O'Brien. And congratulations on the publication of the new book. It's not coming out till March, isn't it?
It's well, they said spring, so I presume it's sometime around then. Yeah, I'm sort of looking forward to that. I hope you'll invite me to do some sort of a talk or an opening or a presentation of the book down in
absolutely
Seán O'Casey Centre.
Yeah.
There's just one other thing I presume. I mean, Joe would know this because I'm not sure if you met her, but I know you met Siobhan O'Casey. Siobhan O'Casey has written the foreword to the book, so she's been very helpful to me in writing the book. And it's also, as I said, Joe's probably aware of this, but Seán O'Casey's great granddaughter, I think it's Agnes O'Casey, is an actress. And Joe mentioned the woman from East Wall who trained at the Lear Academy. Agnes trained at the Lear Academy there up to 2018 or 19. Yeah, it must have been to 2019. She lived here for a number of years training. She was in some productions in the Gate Theatre and various other parts. And to her credit, and I'm sure her father, because he was a great supporter of women's rights, while she was here, she got involved in the Repeal the 8 campaign. So look out for her. She's a lovely woman.
And Paul, she had that starring role in the TV show Ridley Road.
Ridley Road, yeah, great anti-fascist.
Yeah,
Again,
her
I'm sure
granddad would be very proud of her.
Absolutely, very proud of her. Very proud of her. That was a great production, Ridley Road.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll wrap it up now. Thank you very much, Guramila Mahgwith and Slánanish. So we'll finish up now. Bye-bye.
Okay,
Bye,
bye
thanks.
everybody.